Hello, everyone, and welcome back to The Beatles Forever. I've been diving into the book Angie McCartney wrote, and it's been very interesting. So, Angie went from being a widow struggling to having a happy life with Paul McCartney's father, Jim. Angie sure got to change her lifestyle, and it's been neat to have her observations of the famous people that she keeps running into. So, let's see what she's up to today. Angie talks about Lady Jane. She said before Linda Louise Eastman, whom she adored, there was the lovely Jane Asher. And Angie thought that Jane was a wonderful influence on everyone. She was elegant, beautiful, and had genuine high class. Saying that she was comfortable in Angie and Jim's down-to-earth household. She was happy to cook, and she taught Ruth how to knit, crochet. She taught her how to cut out strings of paper teddy bears and make a toy theater from a cardboard box and pipe cleaners. Jane was artistic and inventive and gave Ruth a role model to whom she could look up to. She also inspired young Ruth in becoming a good cook. And Angie said, "Thank you, Jane." So she fitted into family parties, mixing with the rowdies and the drinkers who would party at Rembrandt for the traditional family New Year's Eve party, or at Bet and Mike's, Annie Millie's, or Auntie Jenny's houses, and also cousins Ian and Jackie's home in New Brighton. Angie said that Jane asked her to knit her a full-length jacket one time, and she was happy to do it. Shortly after, she was touring the United States in a Shakespearean play, and Jane sent Angie a thank you gift of some fabulous Stevens of Utica towels. Angie said she kept them for years until they became threadbare. When Jane and Paul got back from Rishikesh after their time with the Maharishi in 1968, they visited Angie, who was in the hospital recovering from an asthma attack. Angie was at the Clatterbridge Hospital. Jane was very gracious with all the patients and nurses who were thrilled to meet her. She brought Angie a beautiful black velvet embroidered evening bag from her trip, and Angie said she still uses it today. Angie said that she recently watched her in a hilarious movie called Death by Accident, and Jane still looked radiant and magnificent. Angie said that Jane now runs a catering business and she specializes in high-end custom-made cakes. She counts Prince Charles as one of her many clients. Angie said the thing she loved about Jane was that although her background was different from theirs, she never let it show. Angie said she would always have the greatest admiration for her and the many things she taught us all. She follows Jane's activities online, her catering business, her acting career, and her philanthropic and charity interests. Angie said that Lady Jane will forever have a special place in her heart. Then she talks about when the Beatles broke up. It was a sad time, of course, and then she said in Merseyside they were out of the loop, and she tried to keep as much news away from Jim as possible. At this time, his rheumatoid and osteoarthritis were becoming even more distressing and painful, and Jim also suffered from shingles, and his nerves were in a terrible state. But it was hard to avoid the news because there was massive television, radio, and newspaper coverage about the breakup. Publicly, they split April 1970, but the legal stuff went on for years. Paul was concerned when John, Ringo, and George wanted to appoint Alan Klein as their manager. Paul wanted his father-in-law, Lee Eastman, to take over, and this caused more dissent among them. On New Year's Eve, 1970, Paul filed a lawsuit against his fellow bandmates. During this time, Paul put on weight, grew a beard, and drank more than usual, and he clinged to Linda for support. They were hounded by the press when they made their appearance in the High Court in London, and it was a very sad and stressful time for them both. The judge agreed his case on March 12, 1971, and the Beatles won a Grammy for Let It Be only 4 days later. Paul and Linda accepted the award from John Wayne, and they were both dressed very casually at a normally black tie occasion. When they took the stage, Paul took hold of the 3 Grammy statues and said, "Thank you," and left the stage. The Beatles were finally dissolved legally in January 1973. There were bad public mouthings of each other, words said in the heat of the moment, and everyone handled it in different ways, but in the end, they were all friends again. Angie said that her and Jim didn't see much of them around the time of the final split. Jim and Paul did talk on the telephone, and Jim never told Angie what Paul said on the subject, but Jim was tearful when he hung up on the phone. He felt deeply for his son and what he was going through at the time. Paul and Linda spent time at the farm in Scotland to reflect on their lives, their future, and his musical career. Paul decided he didn't want to be a solo artist, and the idea of Wings began. Then we come to the statue of the Beatles, which I didn't know too much about. In the early 70s, Pete Bryce was working as a DJ, according to Angie, and he came up with the idea of Liverpool erecting a monument to the Beatles. He wrote to the city council and various other bodies who didn't like the idea. Angie said, "Go figure. They only made the city world famous and made England untold millions, if not billions, and continue to do so in tourism." Pete got mad the more he thought about it. He wrote to the Liverpool Echo about his idea, and by the time he got back home from his working trip, the story exploded. It was featured on radio shows and in the newspapers, and it was the talk of the town. Still, there wasn't a concrete plan. Then Pete contacted the famous Liverpool sculptor Arthur Dooley, and in 1974 they came up with a plan. They thought of a Madonna-like figure with babes in her arms, and this turned into the statue that still stands in Matthew Street, adjacent to the cavern, the famous Four Lads Who Shook the World. It wasn't an easy road. There was a lot of opposition as well as support for the idea. So Pete had a fundraiser, and the statue now has greeted thousands of people all over the world and is a proud fixture in the city. Then Angie talks about Elton John. Angie said that when Paul came home to Rembrandt, he always asked her what music she was listening to on the radio. One time she mentioned Elton John, the new guy who sang Your Song. At that time, Paul hadn't heard of him, and the next party he hosted in London, he included Elton on the guest list. The party was for the launch of the Wings Wildlife album, November the 8th, 1971. The guests included Lulu, David Essex, Keith Moon, Terence Stamp, Ronnie Wood, and many more. Angie remembered when Elton walked into the party. He was sporting a plum-colored velvet jacket, black shirt, and a silver-topped walking cane. He had sprained his ankle that day, and she said he was shy and sat alone against a wall in London's Empire Ballroom, where the party was held. Angie asked various guests to go and talk to him so he wouldn't feel left out. She said now he wouldn't need anyone's help with something like that. Then she reminisced about the Wings fan club. When Paul came up with the idea of a new band, he thought of having a fan club for Wings, and he wanted Angie to handle it. His fan club was to be called the Wings Fun Club. Angie said her middle name was Lucia, so they took the name Lucy and made her secretary. A post office at Heswall Village Post Office, and she put in parentheses she heard they were no longer in business now. And then they were off to the races. It didn't take long for people to hear about it, and soon mail was pouring in. The mailman would deliver the mail, and she would correspond with fans with her trusty portable Underwood typewriter. She bought it for £20. When Jim had given her £20 to put on a horse one day at Chester races, Angie said she wasn't a gambler, and she took the money and sent off for a typewriter. It arrived in a lovely red zippered case. She got Ruth to help, as she did with the Beatles fan club. So Ruth would open the mail, paperclip the envelopes to the letters, check for enclosures such as postage stamps, membership fees, international relay coupons, and items fans wanted to have autographed and returned. It wasn't like the volume of the Beatles-related stuff, but it was a steady job. As time went by, Jim's poor health was more of an issue in their lives, and Paul suggested that the operation be moved to his MPL offices in London. The magazine format later changed to a newspaper type of publication, and the Fun Club remained active until just after Linda's passing, and people still search Google trying to find copies. Angie said you can get them on eBay from time to time. They're a collector's item and expensive. She said it was fun to look back to see yet another venture that started at the dining room table and became a bigger publication. Now Angie talks about the lovely Linda. In the early 70s, the doorbell rang at Rembrandt. When Angie opened the door, there was Linda with her daughter Heather sleeping in her arms, dogs around her feet, and not only one taxi but two in the driveway. Paul had been called away, and she was tired of being alone at High Park Farm near Campbellton, Scotland. She traveled 300 miles to hang out with Angie, Jim, and the family so they could be together again. The plan was for 2 taxis to carry the luggage, the animals, and the humans so that if one should break down on this long journey, there would be a backup. Angie said she went and put the kettle on to brew a pot of tea, and she said she saw Linda pay the taxi drivers from a roll of money she had in her little multicolored rag bag, which she always carried. Angie wasn't sure what that must have cost. It took 8 or 9 hours to get to their destination. She felt sure that Linda thought it was worth every penny to be in the bosom of her family, well, in-laws, instead of watching the mist rolling in on the Mull of Kintyre while Paul was on the road. Linda said that when she was 1 year old, her father, who was a New York lawyer for famous musicians, performers, and songwriters, commissioned Jack Lawrence to write a song about her, simply entitled Linda. It was published in 1946 and recorded by Buddy Clark in 1947. She said Jack was going through a difficult time financially, and Linda's dad said that he could barter for his legal bill with a song. In 1970, Paul wrote a song for Linda entitled The Lovely Linda. Angie said, and lovely she was. When there was criticism in the music establishment, she held her tuneful voice. Angie's daughter Ruth said, often when taking pictures, Linda's own photography taught her to look up when taking photographs. There's always another point of view if you just change yours. And she would say how right she was. And this is interesting. We come to Jim McCartney's song. One afternoon in June 1974, the phone rang at their Beverly Drive bungalow in Heswell. It was Paul calling from Nashville. Angie had handed Jim the phone. Paul said he and Linda were in a recording studio with Chet Atkins, whom Jim admired, and Floyd Kramer. Paul and Chet were talking about their dads when Paul came up with the idea of recording a tune he'd heard Jim play on the piano when he was a boy. But Paul couldn't remember the middle 8 bars. Jim went over to the piano in their living room to play him the tune. His hands were badly affected by rheumatoid arthritis by that time, and he rarely played the piano. Angie held the phone to the piano while Jim played the song, and that was it. A while later, Paul visited Rembrandt with a copy of the record in hand. It was on the Apple label, and it was called Walking in the Park with Eloise by the Country Hams. The B-side was Paul and Linda composition called Bridge on the River Suite. Jim was so happy being a part of the production and holding his own copy in his hands. Angie said she still has the record, and it's been around the world with her on her travels. The public wasn't aware that it was a Paul recording. Angie thought he played washboard on it too. When Angie was at a Beatles Fest years later, she was asked about it and if she wanted to sell her copy, and the answer was a firm no. It was one of the few possessions she treasured from happier times. Years later, Angie said, we were running Cloth Cap Management in Birkenhead when one of their people, Chris Meller, thought that she should be receiving publishing royalties on that song as the sole beneficiary of Jim's will. After a lot of digging, she finally received it. When the Performing Rights Society saw a copy of Jim's will, they began allocating a percentage of the royalties to her via the MPL publishing. They weren't big payments, but always welcome. Angie thought Paul performed it occasionally on stage, thus generating performance royalties. They get to her twice a year, done electronically thanks to those newfangled computer systems. So I'm going to stop the video here. Angie covered a lot of territory in this episode. We got to see Jane Asher's from Angie's perspective, and it sounded like she was a down-to-earth and never thought she was above anyone. And she was also very motherly towards Ruth and taught her a lot of things. Angie admired her and kept up with her through the years by following her on the internet. Then we got to see how Linda did with the family, and it sounded like she was great to be around too. I was surprised to learn that she took a taxi to see Angie, Ruth, and Jim while Paul was away. She was tired of being alone at the farm, and that must have been an expensive trip because not only was it a 9-hour journey, she took 2 taxis. I love that Paul got to record a song that his father composed and that Jim was so happy when Paul gave him the record. I imagine it was like a dream come true because Jim had a band of his own in his early days, and that's how he met his first wife, Mary. It was also neat hearing about the Wings fan club. My sister at that time was more into Wings than I was. I was still holding out for a Beatles reunion. So later I saw information about the fan club, but by then it was too late. That's too bad. Well, I hope everybody liked the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would be greatly appreciated, and it would help my channel out. I wish everybody a good day, and tune in again soon for another episode of the Beatles Forever. Thank you. Bye.